Hi guys, welcome to part 5 of the Mode MZC training course on aldusacademy.net. In this particular course we're going to be looking at programming our zones on the MZC multi-zone controller. In the previous videos we've given you an overview. We've also looked at easy tools. We had a look at how to assign your sources, how to collate and test your commands, and now we're going to be looking at how to use those commands in a zone, and particularly how to program keypads within a zone. So far we've been working from a template. What you can see in front of you now is I just want to bring to our attention what it would be like to start from a completely blank project. So in this project we've got no sources assigned and we've got absolutely nothing in our zones. During the course of this video I will be switching back to the template. I just want to show you how to start a zone from scratch. If I didn't do this, vital steps may be missed, but please bear in mind that it may be quicker for you to load up a template and alter the template to your needs. So I'm just quickly going to choose any particular source. I'm going to select aux and name it anything I like. So I'm going to call it ATV, which is short for Apple TV. I'm going to select apply. You can see it's now appeared in the source setup. For more information on this process, please have a look at the source assignments video. Once I've got a source, I could have multiple sources, but once I've got a source, I have something to make available in that zone. I've only got one source, so I can only make one thing available in this zone. If I select it and move away to another tab, my selection is lost. I need to select it and select apply. Now you can see that this not set up in brackets has disappeared from the name of this zone. It says zone 1 currently, but I could rename this. Let's go ahead and name this kitchen. So this is programming that I'll be applying to the kitchen itself. I can select apply. Now kitchen has appeared. The word kitchen has appeared next to zone 1. There are no keypads in this zone. I know this because the keypads appear between zone 1 and zone 2. So if there were keypads in the zone, it would appear just here. To pick keypads into this zone, I select keypad, and then I have the option of selecting the type of keypad. It's always quite important to add graphic keypads, or the mode 3.1s are free. This is because if you were to control the system from a mode or from a third-party control system, I would need these keypads in every zone because they effectively mimic these keypads. The same is true for the mode free system, where in an undocked wireless fashion, where it's communicating with the mode coordinator, I would need mode 3s or mode 3.1s in every single room that I wish to control with the mode free. If I select apply, I can see I now have a keypad added. It says not set up next to it. That's because I'm yet to assign its address. So I click on mode 3.1 and I select an address and I select apply. I now click on the keypad and I can see an actual mode keypad here. What I'm going to do just quickly is I'm going to add some additional sources. And I'm just going to call them aux. It really doesn't matter what they're called, this is just for an example. So I've got aux and AM, I'm going to select apply. Now I can see more here. If I go back to the keypad, I've still only got one. It's because I need to go back to my kitchen and make sure that I assign, or this zone in particular, and make sure that these sources are available to the specific zone. And select apply. Just while I'm in the screen, I just want to quickly show you the whole house and mute tab. I have certain options. The first set of options is referring to the party mode. This is achieved by doing a long select press on a keypad. So just above the scroll wheel, which I'll show you here, is a select button. It's often important to point out to your customer that this is how they select a button, or this is how they select their source. This select button is programmable by you, the installer. By default, it does not select a menu option, so you must use this select button to make a selection. What happens when the selection is made is displayed in this button's properties. By default, there is nothing happening when any of these buttons are pressed, therefore the MZC will not actually do anything and no audio will be routed. So it's of utmost importance that you actually apply the routing to these commands. This is done within the template for you, but I just wish to highlight it so that if you needed to program a zone from scratch, you are armed with the necessary information to do so. As I mentioned, in a moment I will be switching back to the template, but let's have a look at how we would apply these switch commands. There's two methods. The more thorough way, or the longer way, is to select MZC commands, control commands, and zone 1 select source 1. I've now got this command associated with this source selection button. Let's see what happens if we select zone 2's source 1. It allows that to happen. However, if I was to select zone 2's, or this is the clockwise rotation of this volume wheel, that's for meaning the intended use for this is when I twist this in a clockwise fashion, the volume comes up. Let's see what happens if I, first of all, let's map the correct command. So that's zone 1's volume on zone 1's volume knob, which makes sense. It wouldn't make sense, however, to put zone 2's volume commands on zone 1's volume potentiometer. So let's see what happens when we put zone 2's command on. It tells me that zones are not permitted to control other zones. That's because I wouldn't want this volume command to control the other zone. Let's go back and put our zone 1 volume up command here. If we click away from that button, we can see that's now light blue, indicating that we've got programming applied to this button. So let's delete this command off the button. And what I was about to do a moment ago is indicate to you how I would apply my switching commands to a source. So I've started to do that process. I've clicked on a button and double clicked on the command. But if you imagine if I was to do this for each individual source, it may take a while. So if I delete this command back off and go here where it says zone, I have a few more menu options when I right click on zone 1. One of these menu options, or amongst the standards such as delete all zones or commands, copy zone, paste zone, force zone priority on, which is which keypad takes priority over a source depending on which one was turned on first, or place default AV routing commands. It says A/V because it's audio visual, because it will route both the video feed and the audio feed from a source to that zone. So if I select that, remembering that we had no switching commands assigned to any of the sources because I did the one and then I deleted it, if I now click on these, you'll see that I've got switching commands automatically associated with these sources. That was a lot quicker than manually assigning these commands. The quickness increases when I come to copy and paste between zones, as you'll see later on. The zone number will change. So I don't need to do this multiple times per zone, which is why the recommended project workflow would rarely be that you create your first zone, which is your most common zone, or the zone of which the configuration is standard almost throughout the entire install. I would probably, or mainly, program one zone first, copy and paste that between the additional zones, and then alter any zone which is drastically different. An example of a zone that is different is a zone that would use an AVR as a piggybacked amplifier. That would give you the possibility of powering all 5 speakers in a 5.1 surround sound system, yet being able to control the volume commands from a keypad. Before we look into that, I'm just quickly going to show you 1 or 2 other time-saving things in regards to programming a zone. Bear in mind once again that I am programming the zone from scratch to show you some additional steps that you may miss if I use the template project. So I've clicked on ATV, I've clicked on this clockwise rotation arrow, and again I just want to assign the volume command for the specific zone. As I've shown you, you can't assign a volume command for a different zone, so let's go ahead and assign zone 1's volume up to the clockwise rotation of this volume wheel. I click on this anti-clockwise rotation and assign volume down. If I click on the next source, you'll see that I've only done that for one source. I can right click and I have the option for punch keys commands. This pop-up menu is telling me that it's going to punch this keys commands for all these various sources. I may have closed it down quickly, but it's going to come back in a moment. So now when I click on these other auxiliaries, these other sources, I can see that I've now got this programming applied only on this one clockwise rotation to the other sources. If I jump back up to my source, my first source, and I punch the keys commands, it's this drop down menu, this pop-up menu, or pop-up again, which shows me that this is about to overwrite existing commands under this key for all other sources. I can then select yes to continue. So now that I've selected that, I can see that when I select any source, I've now got that programming applied across all the sources in this zone. This is very time saving, so I recommend that you use the punch keys commands. It's the same regardless of the command in question. I could have applied a command to any of these buttons and decided to punch the keys commands across to all the sources. Let's go ahead and add an iPod into this so that I can show you some of the type of things that you may need to do. So I've clicked on the drop down menu and I've selected iPod. I'm not going to worry about the address 0 will be fine. Now click back on the kitchen, add the iPod as a source, select apply, and now it's appeared on my keypad. So now that I've got the iPod here, I notice that none of these commands are assigned. I can quickly just punch the keys commands across. So this is now assigning these commands to the iPod source. You'll notice that I don't have the switching. So let's go ahead and add that. Place default AV routing commands. So now I have switching and volume associated with this particular source. Let's have a look at this right mouse click and the menu options that it gives us. Starting from the top, I can import a source from template. So here I could have a list of templates that I've exported out of previous projects. I've recently just reinstalled my EasyTools so that you can see exactly what it's going to look like when you install yours. But say for instance I wanted to save a source as a template because it's a common one that I'm going to use on multiple installs and I like the way I've laid the buttons out. Then I can do that fairly easily. So if I click on command library, I'm going to type in SpeakerCraft because I'm controlling a SpeakerCraft mode dock. Double click on mode. And I'm going to double click on mode base. It's now up to me to choose which buttons I want to assign to which physical buttons here. So I can select, or an obvious one would be next track. So if I select next song, I can double click on it and the next song command is now applied to this right hand skip icon. I can then go ahead and say previous song. This is up to you, or supposed to be up to your customer. I recommend that you ask them which buttons they would like to be made available, or if you had some idea of which ones they're likely to use. I can then select on this down option, and I can choose to go menu down 5% or 50. So I can choose how big these steps are. So I've hit menu down and menu up. Now let's go ahead and say menu select. What I've done fairly quickly, you can see it hasn't taken long to map the main commands I'm going to need onto my icons here. Now, let's have a look at what virtual buttons are. Virtual buttons are what happens when I select a source. When I select the iPod, this window here is specifically for editing my virtual buttons and the list or the menu structure that appears after I've selected a source. So my virtual buttons are placeholders where I can add additional commands, but in real life when I select this iPod, when it's programmed and I've got the physical keypad in my hand, it's going to show me the menu structure of that iPod. So having a virtual button list doesn't necessarily make sense. For that reason, it's greyed out. So if I wanted to select a source where there's no built-in menu structure, you can see that I can add to the virtual button list. So if I right click on the virtual button list, I'll get a few more options. A lot of them are the generic copy, paste, delete items that you would sort of expect. But here's how I actually add menu items. So this is what gets displayed on the screen after this AM source is selected using the select wheel. For an AM, in this particular example, as it's a radio tuner, it would make good sense to maybe make preset selections. On the AM tuner itself, preset 1 could be a Pacific radio station. So let's have a look at adding these virtual buttons. If I right click in the virtual buttons window, I can add multiple new menu items. I'm just going to name them preset 1, 2, 3, etc, etc. I'm going to do this the quickest way possible, so I just hit enter and it moves to the right hand side. I've just pasted that preset and hit 2, and this is how you would add multiple presets. Let's have a look at some form of tuner. So if I select OK, I now have 5 preset options that's going to appear when I select this AM button. Nothing happens when these buttons are pressed because there's no star next to the virtual button number. Let's scroll up and let's see if I can find something with various presets. Here we go, I've got a tuner here. I've got preset up and preset down. But let's think of these as the presets. So I click on this preset here and double click on this option. You can now see that when I press preset 1, which is going to be pressable via this select button here, once AM is selected, the command for preset 1 is going to be sent to the tuner. So it's going to switch the tuner to a different station depending on which station this virtual button has been pressed. This is a useful way to create sort of pseudo feedback. For instance, if I was controlling an FM tuner, I could make sure my FM tuner is set up so preset 1 is BBC 1 in terms of the radio station, preset 2 could be BBC Radio 2, etc, etc, and then by pressing the virtual button, which is labelled the correct name, is switching my tuner to that station. So it's kind of like a way of having feedback without needing it. It's still one-way control, but on my keypad it displays the station we are currently listening to. You could have it so that the source turns on to a known station. That way your keypad is always telling you the correct station. Now, what if we wanted to keep the programming that we've done for Pacific Source? In the 2 examples I've just given, we've got 2 different types of programming that we've applied. On the iPod, we've mapped buttons to the hard buttons, the physical buttons. On the AM, we've created virtual button lists. I can mix and match this and create virtual buttons in conjunction with physical buttons. Preset down for this button here, and preset up for this button here might make good logical sense, for instance. But say I now wanted to keep this because I know that I'm going to implement this particular tuner on every job. I could right click and go export source to template. I could call it tuner. And now I could come along and if I felt so inclined, import this tuner that I've just created. It's saying that not all the function options are in the same position and it will overwrite, which is fine because these weren't mapped. They are now. So as you can see, these are the same. What it was telling me was that there was a mismatch and that it was going to overwrite the commands on the previous source, which is absolutely fine. You see that the button properties for the switch haven't been overwritten, so it still switches to the right source. It's just the assignments that were made to the hard button and the virtual buttons. It becomes particularly useful when we've made multiple assignments, like with this iPod. I can just now export it, call it iPod, and now I have a template for the iPod, which is pretty much how I would implement it. So, if I wanted to do this iPod in future, I can just double click on the iPod template and it would import. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I was going to switch over to the template which I had started in the previous video. I won't worry about saving the changes for now. So here we are back at the in the previous project, which is based off the template. You'll notice that this project is a lot fuller. You'll notice that certain things or steps that I took in the previous, such as right clicking here and selecting place default AV routing commands, has been done automatically. I can tell this because I've got the commands for switching the sources to the zones, which don't happen automatically. That happened because I've right clicked and select place default AV routing commands. Looking back at this keypad, I can see that the entire button structure for the iPod has already been done. As you can see, they've chosen to do it in the same way that I have in the previous example. So if I was to save this, I could save this as a template, and it would have meant that I didn't have to make this in the other project, and I can transfer this template from project to project. If I click on iPod, you can see that I haven't got my virtual button, as explained a moment ago. Now if I click over to the Easy Pad, I can see that my default routing commands have been applied here too. And I can see that programming has been applied to this keypad. This keypad is simpler to program. As you can see, there's less options. You don't have the concept of virtual buttons as you do here. I can create virtual buttons for these sources. Now that we've done some basic programming for this zone, let's have a look at one or two other configurations that you might require. Let's have a look at these sources. The first two, or first three, this is the iPod, this is the auxiliary input of that iPod. This is another iPod. This is request. Now request is not only a audio server, but it's also a video server. So there's a chance that when selecting request, what's actually meant is that the video server will be routed to the TV will be turned on, and I will be able to see request on the TV. I don't want the TV to turn on when the zone turns on. I want the TV to turn specifically on when the request option is pressed. If the TV is already on, it will not turn off, because in the previous video I showed you about discrete commands where it will only send one command. So an on command is on regardless of the current state. So let's have a look at some automation here. So when I press request, the TV turns on. I might also wish to switch a matrix, but for now let's just concentrate on turning the TV on. So I've selected request. I've got a Samsung, so I'm just going to type in Samsung. This is the command library which we've just been through in the previous video. And now I want to select television. I'm going to pretend that everything's physically wired into the back of the TV. Generally speaking, you'd probably have an HDMI matrix, but let's just have a look at wiring into the back of the TV for now, using the inbuilt HDMI inputs. So for request, I want the TV to turn on. Now, the TV is only going to turn on, which is great, but when I select iPod, I'm now listening to an audio source through the speakers, but I also still have the TV turned on. It might rarely be a conflict to have the TV on and audio coming through the speakers. So I may wish to copy this command over to multiple sources. By copy, you can actually copy the command, or hold down Control and C to copy it. And I can move to my other sources, and I can just hold down Control and V to paste this in the other sources. So what's going to happen here is, if you're following the logic, is when I turn the request TV, or when I select the request source, the TV is going to turn on, and I can even make it switch to the right input. Now, what happens here is this is what's known as a macro. So these commands run from the top down to the bottom, and a macro is a Latin word, or derived from a Latin word, which basically means grouping multiple instructions into one, or sequencing multiple things at once. So this particular macro has a bit of a problem. For instance, TVs take a moment to power on. If I turn my TV on and send an HDMI input 1 selection command immediately afterwards, as it is in this, then that might be a problem, as the TV is probably not ready yet to accept that command. If I am on HDMI 3 and I turn the TV on and straight away tell it to switch, I doubt they will be turned on in time, especially how quickly this macro runs. In fact, I know it won't. So let's click on line 4, which is our HDMI input selection, and just have a look at how we might go ahead and change this so that it's slightly delayed. Here's a clock with a plus. So what that's for is adding this delay. I've now added a 1 second delay. But looking at where it's placed, it's at the end of the macro, so that's the wrong place to start with. So in order to reorder the macro, I just simply click and drag. Now that it's in the right place, the amount of time isn't necessarily correct. So if I double click on this, I have a little plus arrow. I can increment it to 7.5 seconds if I wish. Those plucks at random. But now it's going to turn or switch the video and the audio. I can delete one of these commands, so now it's just going to switch the video. It's going to make sure the screen's on. And then 7.5 seconds later, it's going to make sure it's on the right input by the time it's ready to accept that command. You would think I need to upload this to an MZC, however I do not. I've got the LTM Learn Test module with me, so I can press this test button and leave it depressed, and then what will happen is as I flick through my sources, you can see I'm getting the waiting symbol, and you can see the delay is actually showing me how much delay I have left. It is running through this macro right now. It's just now finished the macro, and if I select the next, you can see that every time I select a source, what's actually happening is it's outputting it out my LTM Learn Test module. This is very, very handy for learning commands, as I will not need to upload it to my MZC. So far, we've looked at exporting templates so that you can re-import them. We've looked at how you do your switching commands. We've looked at how you build your macros on a command. Now, importantly, these macros don't only have to be for source selections. I'm just going to turn off test because I'm constantly firing IR out my LTM Learn Test module. Now, I could select a button here and I could create a macro. There's quite a bit of programming I could do there. For instance, another example of why you might want virtual buttons is, say for instance this cable was one with multiple channels. Say it wasn't a cable, it was a Sky for instance. I could then say I would create virtual buttons. So if I right click in this virtual button list, I then have the option to add multiple menu items. So if this was a TV for instance, or a Sky Digital package, I might say BBC 1, BBC 2, ITV, Channel 4. I might want to use channel favourite commands here. So if I select OK, I now have these button lists. I can then add 101, 102, 103 and 104 to these buttons, so that when they're selected, the Sky will switch. Cable is actually another command that would use the TV. We haven't turned the TV on. Now it's a discrete, so if I'm flicking between request and cable, it's not going to be noticeable by the end user. So I might as well I could go ahead and just copy and paste commands out of here. I could actually go ahead and copy the keys commands. Then when I get to cable, I could just delete everything, right click and go paste keys commands. But you see it's saying zone 2 video 5, whereas if I click on request, it says zone 2 video 3. So despite copying and pasting across, it's clever enough to know that this has been pasted to another source, therefore it's changed my source number. So you can see that copying and pasting is very powerful within EasyTools, as it doesn't paste it exactly as you've copied it, it pastes it as it needs to be for where it's going. This concept is shared when it comes to copying and pasting between zones. We're now pretty much there when it comes to programming this mode 3.1 keypad in this zone. What we haven't looked at is programming the MKP. The reason I haven't looked at this is I want to highlight the fact that this is the best way to do the programming in terms of your workflow. So I'm currently in zone 2. I've switched over at some point from zone 1, unintentionally, but it doesn't matter. Now if I click on Easy Pad, you can see that even though I haven't mapped this to the source, it's automatically there, because I've just done this programming for the keypad. So it's automatically mapped it to the Easy Pad, which is in particular the MKP1. This is the NKP1 for numeral, and this is the SKP1. Now if I select these buttons, then I can see that I've got my various commands here, which are all mapped to this particular button. So I didn't have to do that multiple times. Now this is zone 2 video 3. Remember I showed you when copying and pasting between sources, it was clever enough to realise that it's now a different source. The exact same concept applies when copying and pasting between zones. So I'm currently in zone 2, so all my commands are zone 2 related. I can now paste this into zone 3. You didn't see that I pasted, but let's rename it. So there's an R there. If I paste it, you'll see that it will wipe over that R. So it pastes it in. But now when I go to select a command, I can see it says zone 3. So I could just go ahead and paste the most common zone across all the zones. And now my programming is applied to all these keypads. And it's all correct. It's all for the right zone. So this is the most basic programming that you would do for a keypad. This is controlling the amplifier within zone 6 of the MZC. There might be times where you wish to control something such as an AVR using the same volume wheel, yet instead of when you twist this volume it's controlling the actual amplifier within the MZC, you may wish for it to control the volume of an AVR, in which case you'll be feeding out the line level. You would make sure the NVC or NC switch is in the MVC position, meaning that it's a fixed line level, and you would then associate the IR commands for the AVR to this scroll wheel, or RS232 if you're using an RSA1. So I select on this clockwise arrow, and I can delete zone 6's commands out of here, because it's not actually going to be controlling zone 6's amp. I'm only doing this for the one source, but it's okay, we can punch the commands across to all the sources as I've just shown you. So if we select command library, let's go for an Integra AV receiver. And I scroll down. I'm looking specifically for the volume commands. There they are right at the bottom. So I can select the clockwise arrow, double click on volume up, and the anti-clockwise arrow, double click on volume down. Now, I just want to draw to your attention one or two things that you can do here. You can right click and you can actually export buttons easy code to the Pronto Hex library, or export Pronto Hex to your copy and paste history, So now that that's there, I can just load up something like Notepad if I wish, and I can paste out the Pronto Hex. So that's the Pronto Hex for that volume up command. Also, if I right click, I can punch the keys commands I've already shown you. But there's one or two other options. I can just change the address of the keypad, or export to Pronto Hex as I've shown you. But so let's just go ahead and punch the keys commands. So that's now applied that Onkyo or Integra volume up to all these sources. If I click on the anti-clockwise, I can then double click volume down. I can right click and select punch keys commands and select yes. Now across all my sources for this zone and this zone alone, it's now controlling the Integra's amplifier, which means if I'm going line level out into the Integra, then the volume will be being boosted or diminished depending on which way I'm twisting this volume wheel. I may need to switch the input of the actual Integra when I select a certain source, if that's how the audio is being routed. in which case I'll just apply the relevant command within the button properties inside a macro. So, in this particular video, we've looked at programming our keypads. We've looked at how easy it can be to copy and paste the program of a keypad across to multiple zones. I've stressed the urgency and how important it is to add mode 3.1 keypads in every zone, especially if you want to use a mode 3, as the mode 3 will rely on these mode 3.1s to be programmed. Even if they're not physically there, they'll need to be programmed into the system. I've shown you how you can quickly and easily place default routing commands. I've shown you how you can paste programming from another zone across into a different zone. I've shown you how you can add macros and paste them across sources. I've shown you how you can map your commands to the buttons and save them as templates. This is pretty much all the programming that you're going to need to do with these keypads. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope you join me on the next one. So I'll speak to you soon. Cheers.